Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you might be in the world. And once again, I'm pleased to welcome a whole raft of international visitors to this webinar from across the globe. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Pam Fox, and I'll introduce Pam to you in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. We'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. You'll also find a chat facility on your screen. You can use this to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we are recording this event and it will appear on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next few days. There you'll find details of our future programme, as well as recordings of other past events which you might enjoy. And so to our guest this evening. Pam Fox is a social historian and a full-time author specialising in Jewish history. She's also the owner of a small business researching family histories. Now, several of Pam's books published over the past few years have been based largely on oral history interviews and have produced rich and engaging narratives as a consequence. And these books have included The Jewish Community of Golders Green, A Social History, published back in 2014, and more recently Jews by the Seaside, The Jewish Hotels and Guest Houses of Bournemouth, published in 2021. Many of you will remember that Pam was in fact our guest in 2022 speaking about that very book. Now, Pam's latest work is this one, Noshtalgia, which is the Bloom's story, 1921 to 2010, obviously relating to the famous restaurant. And this is the subject of Pam's talk this evening. So Pam, without further ado, let me hand over and we're all excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased to be back. And I'm really hoping that you enjoy my talk as much as I've enjoyed writing this book. I've had a ball writing it. So the first slide, please. Okay, we can go over to the first slide. So for the first few minutes, I'm going to be, by way of context, talking through the brief history of Bloom's so that you can see where what I'm going to say later fits in the 90-year history. But the bulk of my talk is going to be about the people who are associated with Bloom's, the Bloom family, the staff, the waiters, and the customers. At the end of that main bit of my talk, I'm going to share some readings from my book, some of the nice stories that appear. There will, however, be lots of time for questions at the end of the session. If we can move forward. Let's start with that brief history that I mentioned. Bloom's was opened by Maurice Bloom as a neighbourhood cafe and takeaway in 1920 in Brick Lane. It was supplied by a very tiny backyard factory where Maurice produced his own recipe salt beef and what became his signature veal Viennas. Due to rapid success, within just a few years, the cafe had moved further up Brick Lane to number 2, which is where the family had their home as well. What's interesting about this second premises that Maurice opened is that it was on the corner of Brick Lane and Old Montague Street, and it therefore got the title of Bloom's Corner. The next big milestone was in 1931 when Maurice launched what he described as an electric sausage factory. I think the electric was referring to how the factory was powered rather than electric sausages. It was just round the corner from Brick Lane at 111 Wentworth Street. This enabled Morris to increase his production, the range of goods that he produced, and he changed his title, his profession, from being a mere sausage maker to becoming a manufacturer and wholesaler. Definitely a move up market for Morris.
Pam, can I just interrupt? I'm just going to have to close the slides. There's a little bit of a problem. Can you just bear with me a moment? I
Sure.
can't. I've just got to try and work out what this is doing. Let me have a think.
Your name's coming up and it's actually
Yes.
hiding some
Yeah,
of
I
them.
can't work out why that is. Change name to virtual background. It's not that.
I can live with it if you don't.
Yeah, it's okay. Let me see if I can do that. Right, let's just have another go. Sorry about this. I've never seen that happen before. But it's that one, isn't it? No, it's still there, isn't it? Is it still there, the name?
It is, yes.
I don't know the answer to this. It's never happened before. Let me just stop. I do apologize. I just can't see why this is doing that. Um, that's because I'm sharing. Sorry about this. Sorry, folks. I'm going to have to put the slides up and see if I can work out an answer. Sorry about this, because you need the slides, don't you?
I can work with your name being on top of it.
Okay. All right. Okay.
It's
People
suggested
just
to
said they
you.
might not be able to see the last line of the slide. Okay. So just if you just bear that. Okay. Should be all right now.
Oh, that's it. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So I think that I got to the electric sausage factory and the fact that he was now a manufacturer and wholesaler. So moving on, by the late 1930s, the cafe had been redesignated. It was now being referred to as a restaurant rather than a mere cafe, which really signified that it was no longer a neighbourhood cafe. And actually, people were now wanting to be there to enjoy the food rather than to snatch food on the run. Sidney Bloom, Morris's son, joined the business in 1939, just before the outbreak of war, and his presence there allowed the firm to expand in lots of different ways. But in particular, it gave them the capacity to take on what they called outside catering, which is where they provided the food for lots of Jewish events. Into the war, sadly, in 1941, Brick Lane took the brunt of a bomb in May that year, which decimated 2 Brick Lane, taking away the family's house and much of the business. Somehow, they managed to squeeze into the factory premises round the corner in Wentworth Street. And even more surprisingly, managed to serve meals all day long throughout the war, despite the bombs raining down on the East End. Next slide, please. Back one. Can we go back? That's 2 slides ahead. Okay, the second part of the Bloom's history, there was a bit of a hiatus in the development of the firm during the war for obvious reasons, but Sydney had really, really big plans for Bloom's. Unfortunately, Morris didn't live to see those plans come to fruition. He died in 1951 and therefore wasn't around to see the opening of the new Bloom's restaurant in 90 Whitechapel High Street in 1952. This restaurant was something remarkably different from anything the family had run before, with its neon lights, plate glass windows, its uniformed waiters, and its white tablecloths on inside the restaurant. It was quite clear now that the Anglo Jewry was aspiring to eat in the same way as the population as a whole. Even more remarkably, that it was just within 8 years that the firm designated the restaurant the most famous kosher restaurant in Great Britain. This was added to the signage outside the shop. And for me, this is really interesting because it seems to signify two things. One is that they were so proud to be a kosher restaurant, but at the same time, now the now strongly Anglo Jewry wanted to be citizens of Great Britain. Shortly after that designation, there was the opening of the Golders Green restaurant at 130 Golders Green Road, where the quality was the strapline. Although it was modelled on the Aldgate restaurant, people tell me that it was very different in terms of its atmosphere and the way it operated. The next big milestone was in 1971 when the factory moved out of its long-term premises in Wentworth Street to North London, North East London, to Barstow. Those premises were absolutely huge and allowed both a bigger range and a lot more capacity to produce goods. And as a result of that, the factory absolutely boomed. It moved into big time, particularly in new produce such as canned and packaged goods. Surprisingly, just as the factory was taking off big time, the Aldgate restaurant had passed its zenith and was now very quickly going downhill. As early as the 1980s, people were starting to talk about the decline of the Aldgate restaurant. It managed to soldier on right until 1996, when it closed its doors for the final time, but it did so with great debts, and the manufacturing arm of the company had to be sold off to pay those debts. It was sold to a firm called Gilbert's, who some people might have heard of, and I'll mention again later. Ownership of what was left of Bloom's, which was actually just the Golders Green restaurant, moved on to the fourth generation of the Bloom family, to someone called Jonathan Tapper, who became the owner in 1999. But it was always a bit of a struggle for Jonathan, and he eventually sold out in 2007 to a businessman he'd been at school with, and the new businessman opened what was a very short-lived branch of Bloom's in Edgware. It actually was open for less than a year. For 3 years, the Golders Green restaurant went into terminal decline, and although there was a great sadness when it closed in 2010, it was regarded as being somewhat inevitable. The conclusion was that it had failed to modernise at a time when it could have made a difference. Before I move on, Jonathan, to the main bit of my talk, are there any burning questions at all in the chat that I need to take?
Not just 1 second. Yeah, the only question is where to purchase the book, but we'll deal with that later on.
Do that later, yeah. Okay, shall we move on to the next slide? So this is the beginning of the main part, and I need to say that I'm a social historian by training, but even more so by inclination. For me, I love to research and write about people and hear the people associated with Bloom's. Okay, if we can move on. So to start with the Bloom family themselves, from the very outset, Bloom's was run as a family enterprise. The family was the firm and the firm was the family. family members worked as a tight-knit unit. They were very hands-on and high profile. A significant proportion of their employees were either relatives or close friends, which reinforced the family feel of Bloom's. Bloom family values, and they were very strong ones, permeated the business and were passed down from one generation of the family to the next. This family orientation was both a blessing but turned out to be a curse. On the one hand, it was pivotal in the success of the business over many years. It led to both staff and customer loyalty. But then on the downside, as the family began to split asunder, so did the business as well. Because it had been so reliant on the cohesiveness of the family, it was also its downfall. Let's have a look at some pictures of the family on the next slide. So here on my left, I don't know whether that's your right, we have Morris and Rebecca Bloom. Morris Bloom was born in a shtetl called Berzay in the northwest of Lithuania, almost right on the Latvia border. And his early years there actually shaped his outlook and values for a lifetime. He came to Britain in about 1911. He initially worked for an established cafe and meat product firm. I don't know if anybody's heard of Barnett's. And for the first few years, he slept on the floor of the place where he worked in order to build up funds to start his own business, which, as I've said, he did by 1920. He was a very ambitious man, both socially and professionally, but also deeply religious as well. He's often described as being a bit of a showman, to be seen in the window of Bloom's carving the salt beef. He married Rebecca Kreisman, you can see there on the right, in 1920. And from the outset, they were full partners in the business. Initially, Rebecca did most of the cooking, aided by her mother, Marion Kreisman, but she continued to be involved for the rest of her life. Like Morris, she was very charitably inclined, but she also liked the good life as well. In the middle there, we have Sidney Bloom with the woman who was his wife, Evelyn Radson. Sidney was born in 1921. He left school very early without any qualifications because he was determined to join the family firm, much to his father's disapproval. Although, like his father, he had ambitions for the business, he was often absent on big race days and big football fixtures. He was a Tottenham Hotspurs fan. He married Evelyn in 1942 in the middle of the war, and she actually became the face of the business. She described herself as being a traditional Jewish mama, but she was actually much, much more than that. She was a very powerful woman, front of house, very, very glamorous, and she drew in a lot of people. Together, they were great socialites. They loved the races and they loved the clubs of the West End. The people on the right-hand side for me is Sylvia, Sydney's younger sister, who married Archie Mallon there on the right-hand side, who was a very prosperous car salesman. Sylvia was quite low profile compared to Sydney and Evelyn, but she was nevertheless a full-time partner in the business. She was very good at staff management and was very, very pivotal in ensuring the success of the Golders Green restaurant. So that's the Bloom family. I'd like to move on to another set of people now, please. Okay, I'm going to talk about Bloom's staff. By 1930, Bloom's was already a substantial employer. It had a big retinue of van drivers, it had several butchers, and it also had some kitchen staff as well. Over the years, Bloom's employed literally hundreds of staff. Some of these were temporary, just passing through holiday jobs, etc. But a large proportion actually remained with the firm for several decades. And in some instances, several generations of the same family worked with Blooms at the same time. Staff were being used very flexibly, moving between different parts of the firm. Quite often on Sundays, which were Bloom's busiest day, people from the factory were called in to help manage the huge queues that formed outside Bloom's. From the outset, the staff were drawn from a wide range of backgrounds, but the workforce became even more diverse after the Second World War. Most notably, Blooms were very keen to employ both Holocaust survivors and refugees from various parts of Europe. They became noted for employing a big number of both Greek and Turkish staff. And quite amusingly, although the Greeks and Turks, who both came from Cyprus, didn't manage to get on in their home country, apparently they got on very well when they're working for Blooms. Several of Bloom's staff went on to much greater things, having acquired experience and skills with the firm. And I might mention in particular a man called Norman Bookbinder, who founded the Gilbert's firm, of meat products producers, and he eventually bought out the manufacturing arm of Bloom's and still markets to this day Bloom's produce. The workforce included some very memorable people with life stories, and I'm going to mention just 4 of them. So if I can have the next slide, please. This is a man called Dick Gowers, who was one of the first restaurant managers after the Second World War. He grew up next door to Sydney and went to the Jews Free School with him as well. They remained lifelong friends, and even when he came to work for Bloom's, they socialised together. After the restaurant closed, they often went up to the West End. His claim to fame is that one of his older brothers was called Sulky Gowers, who was actually something of an East End gangster. And quite often Sulky brought his friends, like the Crays and the Spot Coma, into Bloom's to eat. Next slide. For many years, Bloom's workforce was very male dominated. There were very few women who worked either in the restaurant or in the factory. These 2 women shown on the slide were an exception. They are on the left there, Rochelle Berlin and Benita Singer, though they started life with the surname of Blooms by coincidence. They were twins, and they started at the firm together in the mid-1950s. Rochelle stayed with the firm for about 20 years, but Benita was there for nearly 40 years, which is some years to chalk up. And Benita in particular was noted for her really fast service at the takeaway counter and for being able to manage the rather quarrelsome crowds that gathered outside Bloom's. Okay, the next slide. Oh, I love this story. This is Bambos Pays. He is He was an Armenian Cypriot, neither Greek nor Turkish. He was one of the 4 members of the long-standing chefs team that cooked all the food in Bloom's Aldgate restaurant. He was the pastry chef, but in his spare time, he did some outside catering. And it was while he was doing that that he came to the eye of Princess Margaret, who eventually offered him a job in Kensington Palace as her chef. Ever so coolly, Bambus turned down this offer of employment because he said he much preferred to work at Bloom's. This story went viral in newspapers across the world, and I came across this one newspaper story where he's quoted as saying, "I'm sorry, I can't talk now. I have a cake in the oven and it'll burn, so I need to go." Rather lovely story, I thought. Next slide. Another Bambus, not related. He was a Greek Cypriot, and his story is this: he came to the country in 1958 and initially worked in 2 different Jewish restaurants in the Soho area before making his way to Bloom's in Aldgate. He loved working for Bloom's, and he was a great friend of Sydney Bloom. The 2 went drinking together after hours. He was a carpenter by trade, and by all accounts, he carved the salt beef for the sandwiches with great provision and derided those that couldn't do it with the same precision. In 1966, he was headhunted by Charles Claw to open the salt beef restaurant, the Brass Rail, in Selfridges. And after that, he was dubbed the most sought-after deli man in London, and he had a number of lucrative employments across London. Eventually, in the 1970s, he opened his own salt beef bar in Edgware. It was known as B&K, and it's still there, together with another B&K, which opened a bit later in Hatch End. It's now run after his death by 2 of his sons and by some of his grandsons as well. Okay, shall we move on? Okay, the moment that you've been waiting for. I'm going to talk about the waiters. From the early years, the waiters were the stars of the show. Few people that I spoke to when I was writing this book failed to mention the waiters. They seem to have been both loved and reviled, but in general, they were always seen as an integral part of the Bloom's experience. Above all, they're remembered for their rudeness and offhand attitude to customers, whatever their station in life. They didn't discriminate. The trademark behaviour of the waiters in Aldgate was transferred to Golders Green, but I'm told with less energy and less panache than in Aldgate. The antics of the waiters gave rise to a treasury of Bloom's waiter jokes, which some of you may know and have related. Next slide, please. I have seen numerous descriptions of Bloom's waiters, but this is the one that appealed to me most. They were bickering, grumbling, confronting, insulting, seemingly affronted by the very fact that you had chosen to eat there. It was like being served by a coterie of particularly stroppy cab drivers whom you'd asked to take you to South London, and that came from a writer called Robert Elms. Moving to the next slide. Some of the best known waiters. On the left-hand side, we have a man called Connie Shack. He was another school friend of Sydney Bloom. And he actually started to work in Bloom's before the Second World War. He went off to war but came back again and was a waiter for 16 years. He only left when he was in the process of setting up of something called the Kosher Luncheon Club, which became very famous. It was based in the Great Garden Street Synagogue just round the corner from Bloom's. Much to my amusement, I learnt that when he'd been serving in the war, he was in Greece and he'd learnt how to speak Greek very fluently, and he was able to use that to keep the Greek waiters in check that he worked with. In the middle there, we have Lou Dean, who I think was probably the most famous and, without doubt, the rudest of the Bloom's waiters. He worked for the firm for some 30 years. And by the time he left in the early 1990s, he was the only Jewish waiter that was left working for the firm. He had the most beautiful singing voice, and he was often to be seen entertaining the crowds that gathered outside Bloom's. And he was once filmed by Esther Rantzen for That's Life. He singing My Yiddische Mama. The man on the right-hand side, some of you may recognise as being Leon Nicholas, who was perhaps the most prominent of the Greek waiters that worked for the firm. He worked for, I think, over 40 years, and he was still there when Golders Green closed in 2010. He was a larger-than-life character, known as the Walrus, for obvious reasons. And he was known for his somewhat tempestuous arguments that he had with the Bloom family. Quite often he ripped off his jacket, threw him down and left the premises, but he always returned. He had a son called Nick, who was also a waiter, but he was rather lost in the limelight of his father. By the time Golders Green closed and the restaurant was somewhat run down, he'd lost the N on his name badge, and a lot of people thought that he was called Leo rather than Leon. Okay, moving on. Good to talk about Bloom's customers the earliest part of Bloom's history. The first diners and takeaway customers were largely recent Eastern European immigrants, mainly single men who'd come to the country ahead of their families, trying to make a living and establishing themselves both socially and economically in the East End. In the early years, the produce that Morris made was either used for the cafe, or what was left over was sold to local barrow sellers who trundled his wares around the East End. Bloom's Cafe was very soon attracting customers from much further than the East End, and by the 1930s, it was the go-to place for upwardly mobile customers who'd made it out of the East End and were now living elsewhere, but were coming back to the East End for various family or business reasons. It was also a haven for second-generation immigrants who were not yet ready to leave the safety of the semi-ghetto of the East End, but wanted somewhere where they could be Jewish, particularly in the face of the anti-Semitism of Mosley and his cohort. Just before the Second World War, the factory was selling meat products to a network of kosher butchers, not just in London, but way beyond into the home counties. Next slide, please. Customers after the Second World War, the new restaurant attracted diners from far and wide, and the factory was beginning to distribute not just around London, but nationwide, was establishing networks to do this. The main diners at the Aldgate restaurant were multi-generation family groups, both those that lived outside the East End and who were still there. But there were also some very rich and famous people that came both from this country and abroad to see the very now famous Bloom's restaurant. It was very egalitarian. The rich and famous rubbed shoulders quite happily with the market traders who frequented Bloom's on a regular basis. By the 1970s, the factory was supplying supermarket chains that were mushroom up and down the country, particularly stocking the shelves with canned and packaged goods. It was big business. They also were expanding in their catering contracts and the takeaway trade, even when the restaurant was going downhill, was still very buoyant indeed. Interestingly, during the 1980s, the Aldgate restaurant started to attract clients from the nearby city, which was becoming more and more buoyant, both Jews and non-Jews, and even more when the Docklands development took off a bit later in the 1980s. By the 1990s, I've already said that the Aldgate restaurant was quite a sad affair, and there were mainly non-Jews who ate there. There were just a few stalwarts from the parts of Essex, such as Ilford, who loyally went to eat in Aldgate. Golders Green always had quite a different clientele from the Aldgate restaurant. They never had the celebrities to the same extent that Aldgate did. Their mainly older clientele, mainly middle class, did remain loyal for another decade after Aldgate closed, but even by then most had left it, and there was certainly no young people eating in the Golders Green restaurant. Moving on. Let me talk a little bit about the famous customers who I briefly touched on the slide. I wanted to read you a bit of a kind of roll call of the sort of people who went to the Aldgate restaurant. So in terms of very famous Jewish names, there were Dustin Hoffman, Barbara Streisand, the Marx Brothers, Ron Moody, Alan Sugar, Elkin Allen, Ronnie Scott, Donald Pleasance, Warren Mitchell, Georgia Brown and Lionel Bart, and Joe Loss, who incidentally was the act when the restaurant opened in 1952. There were some famous Labour MPs. Gerald Kaufman went to the restaurant, and even royalty such as Princess Diana and Princess Margaret. Much to Sidney Bloom's delight, Bobby Moore and sometimes the whole of the Tottenham Hotspurs football team went to dine at Bloom's. And also to be seen at Bloom's on a regular basis were Elizabeth Taylor, both with Eddie Fisher and then Richard Burton, Tom Cruise, Telly Savalas, John Cleese, Barbara Windsor, Hughie Green, Dickie Henderson, Arthur Askey, Donald Southerners, and when he was in town, Orson Welles, and also famous pop stars as well. The partly Jewish Mark Bolan was in Bloom's the night before he died in a car crash. And one evening, Cliff Richard was there, and his fans almost broke the plate cast windows wanting to try and get to him. Tony Blair had a fondness for kosher food and sometimes went there both on his own and to take his father-in-law, Tony Bruve. And lastly, I might mention Charlie Chaplin, who was a close friend of Sidney Bloom, sometimes to be seen there with his wife, Una. So that just gives you a feel about the famous people that went there. Shall we move on? Okay, and I can't leave this talk without mentioning the bagel sellers, who were very famous. To get into Bloom's, you had to run the gauntlet of people selling bagels outside the restaurant. For many years, the two bagel sellers were Esther and Annie Bloomfield. In that picture on the left, you have Esther at the front, who sadly died in 1950 after an accident, and at the back, her daughter, Annie. Although they were mother and daughter, they hated each other. And when they weren't cursing customers who were not buying their bagels, they cursed each other. When Annie died penniless and without any family members in a Jewish care home in 1988, still cursing, I'm told. And because she was destitute, a lot of the people who had known her at Bloom's restaurant clubbed together to buy a headstone for her, which I thought was very moving. Their place was taken by a man called Izzy Cohen, who had previously run a chain of grocery stores. I think they were called Cohen's Cash Stores. But he got bored when he retired, and he eventually managed to get hold of the prize spot outside Bloom's. Okay, that was the end of my presentation, so we can move on to the slide, which says something about the book, but perhaps you don't want that. And I'm going to talk about some stories from the book, but I think, are there any burning questions at all, Alan, that you want?
Well, yeah, Pam, we've had a few questions, and I think they possibly some of them raise bigger themes that you might want to talk about. So Irene Glausich, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Irene. She's interested where Bloom's got their hechsher, their kosher supervision. Where did this come from? And I suppose that might be a nice segue to some of the problems they had with supervision later on.
Yeah, I don't think people realise that the showmers who worked for Bloom's were actually employed by the restaurant. So they were supervised and they got their licence from the Bet Din, from the United Synagogue. But it was down to them to employ their own staff to ensure that the rules and regulations set out by the United Synagogue were actually adhered to. And they had a long-standing shomer at Oldgate who was called Mordechai Rabin. I think he was there for several decades, but then in between times and at busy times, they also brought in people who could supplement him to do their job. And in particular, when the factory took off, when it moved to Blastow, they employed even more showmers there to ensure that all the rules were adhered to. And it was one of the showmers who noticed what was meant to be the licensed meat hadn't got the credentials that it needed to, and was one of the reasons which eventually led to the decline of Bloom's.
Interesting. Now we have a question from Honey Anderson. I hope you managed to get your slides working, Honey. The waiters were known to be quite rude. You pointed this out. But the question is, was this deliberate? Was it something that the management encouraged?
Oh, it's quite a good question, actually. I think that it was their kind of hallmark, if you like, and they kind of, over the years, they fashioned it and took it to extremes. But interesting from my point of view is how they acted as a role model and transferred what had been their kind of pantomime way of acting to both the kind of Greek and the Turkish waiters who came after them. They kind of modelled that kind of the antics and the bad behaviour, if you like. A low it did bring in business. I mean, some people actually specifically went to Bloom's to believe it or not, to have them be rude to them. But I think the family were a bit reticent about saying that they positively encouraged it. I wrote the book in liaison with some family members, and when I started getting all these stories about just how rude they were, they wanted to play down a bit, but eventually they realised that they had to accept that that's how the waiters were seen. Yes.
Well, one of the things you pointed out in the book, which is quite interesting, is that the waiters would have preferred people to buy dishes which were very quickly prepared so that they could turn the tables round. But I also got the impression that they were very hesitant to send anything back to the kitchen. I think that would have probably been difficult for them. So maybe it was, the constraints of how they were working in part that gave them that attitude.
Yes, I think it was. I don't know if you remember this. I was describing in the book about what they called the booking system, whereby all the meals that were ordered were physically noted as they left the kitchen, so that the Bloom family knew exactly what each of the waiters should be giving to them at the end of the evening, because that's what they'd had it kind of against their name. So that gave a rise, actually, as I describe in the book, to the myth that the waiters weren't actually paid a wage, which is not true, but that they paid for the food and got it back from the customers. Actually, that was not the case.
Wasn't the case.
No.
Ray White is asking about the B&K restaurants. Are they kosher restaurants?
No. They're not. They're not. They were very much modelled on both the Aldgate and the Golders Green restaurant in terms of their menus and what they sold and the recipes as well. But they were never kosher. What's interesting about the B&K restaurants, which I didn't mention, I should, is that not only are they really popular still in northwest London, but recently they've acquired 3 salt beef bars in central London, which have really taken off both for Jews and non-Jewish customers. Yeah.
Alan Benstock is interested what happened during World War II. What changes did the restaurants have to make? Did the menu have to change at all? How did they manage?
Yeah, they had real problems getting their normal food. And I think some of what they did get was acquired by slightly nefarious means. But I'm told that during the war, there was a lot more chicken than beef that was eaten at Bloom's, but still plenty of food to go round.
Interesting. Did you say you wanted to do a reading?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
just some quick stories from the book.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
So you get a flavour. So I interviewed, like I did for my last book, Bournemouth book, over 100 people, and there were some great storytellers who gave some lovely descriptions of Bloom's. Can I, at this point, I don't know whether you can see.
Yeah, we see him.
I'm going to bring in my husband, Michael Hart, who has kindly volunteered, in inverted commas, to be my readers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a few stories, and then he's going to read the excerpts in the book. So I'm going to start with one of the best storytellers, who's a man called Philip Bagel. And he told me about the car park at the Aldgate restaurant, which for some reason there's so many stories about it, manages to occupy, I think it's a whole 3 pages in my book. Here's the car park story.
When arriving at the Whitechapel restaurant, we parked in the car park, which you access by driving through an alleyway between 2 properties a few shops away. It led to a large open space behind and amongst the surrounding shops, which seemed somehow bigger than the laws of nature should allow. This TARDIS-like car park was watched over by an entrepreneurial man with a much weathered alien-like face, who extracted large amounts of money from people with more hunger than sense in return for so-called protecting your car from all possible galactical mishaps. We always made a prompt exit from this spooky space, with our children holding tightly to our hands as we sped towards the restaurant.
As I mentioned, the first factory was in Wentworth Street, and I had the good fortune to speak several times to a man called David Reen, who was a butcher for over 25 years at the factory. And the book would have been worse for not having spoken to him, because his descriptions of the factory were lovely. And here's one particular description.
Maybe if you're vegetarian, turn down the sound for this one. The quarters of beef were offloaded from the lorry straight onto the pavement where people walked. Not very hygienic. The delivery men hefted the meat onto their shoulders, shoved them through an open window, and pushed them down a hole to the basement, where they arrived onto a big table where 6 butchers of many different nationalities worked. This is where the porging was done. When I first went to work in the factory, meat was still rationed, and the meat wholesalers were paid a little bit extra to ensure that Bloom's received a ready supply.
So it's back to what I was saying just now. I mentioned the team of chefs in my talk, and in particular, I mentioned Bambas Payas, but there was also one of the other chefs was a Polish man who went by the name of Sid. He came to the country at the end of the Second World War and sprinkled his conversation with Yiddish, which was actually his first language. Norman Bookbinder, who I mentioned, who went on to greater things, recalled this about Sid.
Everything Sid made was fantastic, but he had a bad temper. I remember Mrs. Bloom once came into the kitchen saying that a woman customer had commented that the tzimmus were a little salty. Sid picked up a chopper and, brandishing it, he shouted, "Salty? I'll give her salty." He ran towards the kitchen door, making for the restaurant. Thankfully, somehow, bloodshed was averted.
Some stories about the waiters. One of the regulars at Bloom's in Aldgate was Danny Kaye. And once when he was appearing in London, he went into Bloom's. And here is a story that was recorded by the critic Simon Blumenfeld.
Inside Bloom's was like a repertory company, waiters who must have been at heart actors. They took their job seriously, not as a profession, but as a vocation. Moishe, the head waiter, a burly Lithuanian, approached our table. "Yes?" Danny looked around. "Where's the menu?" "No menu," said Moishe stoutly. "I am here. You tell me, I bring." "A menu," said Danny Kaye firmly. "I'd like to read the menu." "This is a restaurant," Moishe rebuked him, as though speaking to a child. "You come here to eat. You eat. You want to read? Then you go next door to the Whitechapel Library." End of Bloom's Act 1.
I mentioned that the most famous waiter was Lou Dean, and he had his own inimitable way of dealing with fussy customers. According to his son, here's a story.
If someone grumbled to my father that the Lokshan soup was not hot enough, he'd say something like, "Well, lucky for you, then it won't burn your tongue."
And the writer Robert Elms, who I mentioned just a bit earlier, also had this story.
My favourite story of Bloom's hideous rudeness concerns a man who ordered mashed potato with the chopped liver or tongue, but instead he received boiled potatoes. Upon politely pointing this out to Lou, the famously ferocious waiter, Lou picked up the man's fork from the table and proceeded to crush the spuds while shouting, "You want mashed potatoes? I'll give you mashed potatoes." And just one more little story which Pam agreed I should add in. There's a story by someone called Mike Mendoza, who records that he ordered a load of food for his lunch one day, but the waiters forgot one of the dishes. When he mentioned this to the waiter, the reply came back, "You're fat enough. You don't need any more to eat."
Very, very
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you. We have a question. Actually, this is an interesting one from Phil Cammerman. He mentions a Soho restaurant on Berwick Street. I don't think that's been mentioned.
It wasn't the same. It wasn't the same Bloom
It
family.
was a different Bloom.
It was a different Bloom.
That's explained.
If you look in the book, I explain that there's often confused with Blooms. He was called B.B. Bloom or something like that, and he's actually a member of the same synagogue as Morris Bloom and his family, but they were definitely not related.
How interesting. Now, there's lots of really interesting comments. There are people who remember the sawdust on the floor in Brick Lane. So what we will do is forward all those comments to you afterwards so you can have
Yes, please.
a read through them. We have put in the chat where people can get the book, but we'll also send out with our follow-up email tomorrow the link. The book is available directly from Pam. It's absolutely fabulous. It's a really great read, and particularly if you remember Blooms, and I remember going there as a child, it really brings it all back to you. It's really, really interesting. It's a really great read. So thank you, Pam, for being our guest this evening, and to say thank you to you. I'll send you a book of some of my photographs. Hopefully you can see that. Hopefully you'll enjoy reading that. Now, a few words about our forthcoming programme before we go. Next week on Tuesday, we have a live event in Leeds. This is with the best-selling author Anne Seba. Anne will be speaking about her book, The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, and unusually for a live Millim event, this one is free. So you can register on our website at millim.org.uk. Please do come to that. That is also a really excellent book. Who would have imagined there was a female orchestra which performed in Auschwitz? We have a short break then until the 9th of June, when Jordan Rosenblum joins us from the USA to discuss his book, Forbidden, a 3,000-year history of Jews and the pig. Following that, we've got a really busy summer programme. Please visit millim.org.uk, sign up to our newsletter, and then you will be sure to be first to hear about everything up and coming. As you know, all our online events are free. Some of our live events are free, but you can make a donation to support us if you wish. There is a link in the chat or visit our website. So it remains for me to thank our guest, Pam Fox, once again. Thank you so much. That's been really, really fascinating. And looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.
Bye.